All right, sorry, had to help out a student there really quickly. Let's get back to this, and I'll just record this as two separate videos, and it'll be okay. All right, so I believe we're going to pick back up with the Muslim contribution or the Golden Age of Islam. Again, with the establishment of the Abbasid Empire from roughly 750 to 1258 Common Era CE. Great libraries would come to be established throughout the Muslim world in places like Timbuktu or Cordoba in Moorish Spain, Cordoba. I believe it's in your book as well. This in Spain, there were the typically black African Muslims that were living in Spain that were known as the Moors, Moors. They were kicked out several times and came back several times, depending on what point in Spanish history we're talking about. A lot of them provided the artisan work that became associated with a lot of Spanish and Moorish art and architecture of the time. So when the Spanish crown would kick them out at various different times, it was always to the detriment of Spain. However, there was also was also libraries in the capital of the Abbasid Empire, which was Baghdad. Modern day Baghdad was ancient day Baghdad. Uh, the first centers of higher learning were also established to allow for further exploration of legal and religious studies in the Islamic faith. So these madrasas encouraged both theological and legal study, but not scientific. So the book queries, wouldn't it be logical then with all of these higher, studying, higher education places, all of these universities as we know them now, wouldn't it make sense that so much scientific education and study would happen and have come out of the Middle East? Well, yes and no, because again, the madrasas were very heavily focused on legal and religious studies, not on natural philosophy, not on science. So, what would happen though is these madrasas in places like Cairo, Fez, which is modern day Morocco, and Constantinople would become, central points of, higher study, higher learning. So while the madrasas were focused more on the legal and religious side of things, the attitudes that followed those madrasas in those major metropolitan areas would become, key to the development of other philosophers, other scholars' thinking. So, with the madrasas and the cultivation of higher learning that came up around them, you would have discoveries by both Arab and Persians in science and math. You would see the creation of algebra, the algorithmic processes, algorithms that we take for granted today when we talk about things like, our music apps of choice, picking the right songs or wrong songs for us because we got the algorithm going. The concept of algorithmic processes dates back to Persian, Arabic scholars of this time. The decimal point system, study in medicine and astronomy, physics, all heavily studied by these Muslim thinkers, these Islamic scholars that, again, spread throughout the empire, but especially found in the places where there were the future universities. One Egyptian scholar, Al Haytham, experimented to the point of first understanding the nature of light waves and that light travels in a straight line. Again, very important discoveries going on about 350 years before we'll see them coming to affect the scientific revolution of Europe. So, huge contributions well ahead of time that most, history books don't necessarily cover until more recently. Despite being centers of learning, the madrasas did not encourage the dissemination of the wealth of knowledge to all. Again, these were very, if you were wealthy, you went to a madrasa. If not, you didn't get the education. So it was still very biased in that way. However, within a century, more or less, following the Black Death, European monarchs had begun to re-centralize control over their kingdoms. You know, with this centralization came the Renaissance, or the long-term ramifications would be the Renaissance. As you had centralization of powers, you had wealth growing, and when wealth grows in these places within Europe or re-centralizes within Europe, you have the emergence of kind of similar places of higher education, similar universities forming to explore the nature of the world and of the world above us. Catch back up in my notes. I apologize. With the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottomans, and again the Muslim Ottomans at this point, there was a spread of knowledge happening because a lot of the Christian thinkers, a lot of the Christian scholars that lived in Constantinople feared being ruled by the Islamic caliphates that had taken over. With that, as these great thinkers began to flee Constantinople, they would form new centers for higher learning and establish many of Europe's oldest universities. So again, the cause and effect. Constantinople is overrun by Islamic forces in 1453, and when that happens, a lot of the Christian scholars that lived in Constantinople flee. When they do that, they typically wind up, and again over the course of their own generation and the following, they wind up in places throughout Europe that become, known as centers of learning later on. Okay, so with that, let's end that section of your notes and pick up with what your textbook labeled Scientific Thought to 1550. To answer the workings of nature prior to the Renaissance in Europe, you boil down to one answer, typically. Aristotle's work on natural philosophy that dated back to, around 300 BCE. So we're looking at some really old information here. But Aristotle's work had been interpreted by the church to fill in the unanswerable questions posed by more scholarly minds. Anything to do with nature was deferred to the Greek answer in this way. The church was able to maintain its dominance, controlling this information, again, illiteracy playing a huge part in that, also controlling the eternal souls of, people that would ask these questions had kind of a iron-fisted effect, so to speak, on people's minds. You only questioned a little bit because if the church didn't like what you were questioning about, they would threaten your eternal soul with damnation. Not very reassuring, right? The church was able to maintain its dominance by controlling information. The universe was thought to be geocentric at this time, or follow the Ptolemaic view, which means that, as Aristotle defined it, Earth was at the center of 10 celestial rings, 10 crystal spheres, if you will. And these crystal spheres contained the sun, the stars, the heavens, moon, and all of the, different levels were kept in motion by angels. Angels were believed to keep these spheres in motion, and furthermore, according to Aristotelian thinking, anything that was sublunar, or of the earth underneath the moon, which is us on earth, was constructed of the four elements, water, earth, air. We're not quite to the four natures of humans yet, or the what would later be known as the phlegm and bile and yellow bile and blood, like the things that medical professionals of the time believed that humans were composed of, minus the soul, were these four elements. But everything in the Aristotelian way of thinking, Aristotelian, was that all things on earth were composed of some combination of four key elements. So again, it was this type of mindset and understanding that the scholars of the scientific, revolution were kind of fighting against. Aristotle, again, circa 300 BCE, had sought to answer these questions of what we now know as science, what they were calling natural philosophy at the time. He sought these answers out, and the church had taken that work and translated it to answer these questions that scholarly minds asked about, what is the nature of the universe, etc., and all of those great questions. Well, the church did not want to relinquish control over the answers, so when they interpreted Aristotle's work to fit their own needs, it was the scientific revolution and the emergence of the scientific method, a little more observation-based scientific, what we associate with science now, approach to answering these questions. So, With that, let's divide off into astronomy and physics for our first discussion point in this part of the chapter. Copernicus is our first scholar of note. His greatest contribution to the scientific revolution was to donate the concept of the heliocentric universe. Helios, from the Greek meaning sun, centric, central point. So, he is talking about one where the sun is the stationary point and all other planetary bodies revolve around the sun. This was not meant to question the reality of the heavenly bodies or crystal spheres that Aristotle and the Greeks had theorized about. Rather, Copernicus believed that a deity would have created a more perfect system in the form of a less cluttered universe. I misspoke earlier. I believe I attributed that to Kepler. This is Copernicus's assertion that the Ptolemaic view of the universe was so clunky, I believe, as I described it earlier, that the Christian God was more perfect than, something, an entity, a deity that would have created so, clunky a universe. Let's see. Rather, Copernicus believed that a deity would have created a more perfect system, right? The heavens prior to this time were the Ptolemaic view, as I discussed earlier. In 1543, the year that he died as well, Copernicus published his findings or his theories on the revolution of heavenly spheres. I always say he did this near the end of his life because he didn't know how it was going to be received. But either way, that's where I'm going to end this section shortly and start another video in a moment.